party. The government representing your party seems to be staggering between misfortune and disaster. Why is this happening?
Well, first of all, I think you overstate it. There have inevitably been difficulties, and most of these come from failing to win an outright majority in the election in June. But the events that have taken place over the last couple of weeks, the two ministerial resignations, are the sort of things that happen to all governments of all kinds and are broadly outside prime ministerial control.
Well, they're not really, are they? The sorts of things that regularly happen. I mean, we have a minister, Priti Patel, who resigned, clearly asked to resign, after the most extraordinary diplomatic gaffe where she appeared to go completely freelance, diplomatically speaking, in a visit to Israel.
But I can probably match you embarrassing resignation for embarrassing resignation going back over decades, and the best of these is, of course, Peter Mandelson, who resigns twice over breaches of the ministerial code from essentially the same government. This happens to governments with big majorities and governments with small majorities. It happens over breaches of the ministerial code. It happens over sex scandals. This happens in government, and it doesn't indicate the weakness or the strength of the government. That is determined by other factors.
It surely does signal that this Prime Minister is seeing her authority drain away. I mean, Priti Patel, to continue with her case, surely would have not felt able to undertake the sort of diplomatic freelancing she did were it not for this lack of authority at the centre of government.
I think you're seeing causal effects where they don't actually exist. I mean, to go back to the now Lord Mandelson affair,
well,
the first time.
I prefer to stick with current events, if you don't mind.
It's quite important because you need to get a perspective as to, is this resignation something exceptionally unusual, or is it the sort of thing that happens to all governments? Bear in mind, when Lord Mandelson first resigned, it was because he'd accepted a loan from somebody in another ministry, hadn't declared it in breach of all the ministerial codes, and this was very embarrassing to Tony Blair at the time. But it was unimportant in the grand scheme of the Blair government.
We can fill the airtime discussing ancient history, but I'd rather continue discussing what's happening in this government, your government today.
Well, it's not my government, Her Majesty's government. Nice of you to give it to me. But the key to this is there something unusual about the problems this government is facing, and do they come, as you propose, from weakness, or are these things that just happen to governments and have happened continually to governments, not just over recent decades, but over centuries? Do you want to go back to the Stonehouse affair?
I'd prefer to focus on whether this government can continue. I mean, we know that Grant Shapps, a significant backbench Tory MP these days, called for Theresa May to go, asked for others to join him in a campaign to topple her. He got a significant number of former cabinet ministers to back him, but not enough. The point is...
hold on a moment. I don't think we ever found out who any of these cabinet ministers, former cabinet ministers...
Well, if you're not prepared to take his word for the support that he got, that's your affair.
No, I think that when names are bandied about, it's useful to know what those names, whose those names belong to, and that it's very easy to say there's lots of support. I also think there's something, and you said it flatteringly about me as well, something marginally inaccurate about influential backbenchers. If you're that influential, you're not a backbencher.
Let's get to the situation regarding Boris Johnson, Foreign Secretary. He misleadingly suggested that a British citizen who's currently being detained in prison in Iran, arrested last year, he suggested that she was in Iran training journalists. Now, that's not true. She was there on holiday. Boris Johnson surely has to go for something which has not only exacerbated a humanitarian crisis for that particular family, but also a terrible diplomatic gaffe.
Boris Johnson was giving evidence over an extended period to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. He made a mistake. He misspoke, to use a modern turn of phrase.
There are times when you can't afford to misspeak.
Well, he's clarified it both with the House of Commons, and he's spoken to the Iranian Foreign Minister to make the position clear. I don't think you can expect ministers to resign every time they misspeak. You need to have continuity in government, and you need to recognise that ministers will make mistakes, and the question is the level of seriousness, and I don't think this meets the test of that kind of seriousness.
Well, your perspective is clearly different from that of her family. They are appalled by what has happened, not least because Iranian state media today has been saying that Mr. Johnson's words were proof that she was there for reasons which were not those presented by the British government.
Look, I've obviously seen those reports that have come out recently in relation to what the Iranian government is doing. And it is obviously difficult that the Iranian government is using a mistake by the Foreign Secretary to advance its own political agenda. But the greatest fault of this is the Iranian government for unfairly and unjustly detaining somebody, preventing her from seeing her own children, a child, and family, and doing this on the bogus pretext of spying. We've got to look at where the real fault is, rather than in the misspeaking.
The former Tory MP Matthew Parris, whose column you probably read in the Times newspaper.
Oh, it's a brilliant column and always readable.
Yes, and he's concluded that both in professional and personal life, Boris Johnson's proved himself entirely unfit for high office.
In spite of the fact his column is an extremely readable one, it doesn't make it infallible.
Well, of course it doesn't make it infallible.
I don't agree with Matthew Parris on this. And Mr. Parris has long been critical of Boris Johnson. He's never been one of his leading admirers. And newspaper columns, which my father used to write for many, many years, have to ensure they have something interesting to say day after day and to meet the deadline for the next day's news. They are not Holy Writ.
Michael Fallon had to resign because of allegations of sexual impropriety. We've seen Priti Patel resign. On each occasion, Theresa May has chosen a simple one-for-one in-out swap. Is it not time for a much bigger, more thoroughgoing cabinet reshuffle to put some new energy, some new blood into this government, which frankly to many people looks like it is flailing?
Well, I think Mrs May is in the happy position of having an embarrassment of riches. She's got a wonderful and able cabinet, and she's got many people in the Conservative Party who came in 2015 and 2017.
But the question was, is it time for a much bigger reshuffle?
Not necessarily. I think the cabinet that we've got is a very good quality cabinet. It has some really serious and able individuals in it who are doing important work. I don't think... As it happens, I think that a big reshuffle is very often a greater sign of weakness than in strength. And I know you don't like me going back over history, but Harold Macmillan's Night of the Long Knives was an indication that it was the beginning of the end. It was a sign that he was losing control. Greater love hath no man than he lay down his friends for his political life, I think was Jeremy Thorpe's comment on the Night of the Long Knives under Macmillan. And I think a big reshuffle can look as if you've lost confidence in your earlier judgment, and I think there's much ability in the cabinet.
Do you ever pause to think how the British government currently looks when viewed, for example, from Europe? Because this is the issue of the age, if you like, is the Brexit negotiation. So it rather matters how perceptions are right now of the British government in Europe, across the European capitals. What do you think they're like?
Well, I think there's what they want to say and what they think of it. If you think that Theresa May got 10% more in the election we had than Mrs Merkel got in her election, Mrs May has a government, Mrs Merkel doesn't. Look at the Spanish government. Would you rather be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or Prime Minister of Spain at the moment? What about Italy? The chaos there.
Well,
Holland has finally got a government 6 months after its election.
Let me give you a somewhat different perspective.
So compared to continental governments, this government, Her Majesty's government, is really pretty strong and stable.
Peter Ricketts, who till quite recently was the top civil servant at the Foreign Office, he says this: I think if you're in a European capital, it looks, that is the British government, chaotic, confused, drifting at a time when there are massive issues around Brexit, no clear line from the cabinet about the future relationship with the EU, and a whole series of other crises as well. Britain is simply not a real player right now.
I think this is absurdly overstated. That there is a clear idea for Brexit, and that was enunciated by the Prime Minister in her Lancaster House speech and in her Florence speech. There are bits of it that I'm not enthusiastic about, but it's a very clear...
We have
to talk about that. But it's a very clear manifesto for what she's looking for. The Prime Minister has been very generous in the offers she's made to the European Union, and the government she leads is stronger than many, though not all, but many continental governments, and perhaps most importantly Germany. The German government is really weak at the moment because it isn't even formed, it hasn't even agreed lead its coalition, and there was the extraordinary rise of the far right in Germany in its recent elections.
You talk of European weakness. The one point I think that is clear is that the EU 27, that is those members without us, are absolutely united when it comes to the Brexit negotiations. There will be no evolution of the talks to the next phase, that is to talk about trade and the transitional arrangements, until, and this came out yesterday at a meeting of the 27 EU ambassadors talking specifically about Brexit, no move to that until they are happy with the cash that is going to be promised by Britain to cover the costs of our departure.
Well, the counter to that is that the multi-annual financial framework is insolvent if we leave without a deal. That's what they're facing.
Oh, you think hardball will work?
I call that bluff. Yes, they are desperate for £20 billion between March 2019 and the end of 2020. The multi-annual financial framework...
Theresa May's already promised them that. The question is what beyond she's prepared to offer.
No, that's only on the basis of a deal.
Yes, absolutely. So you're saying, great, no deal. Let's walk away without even paying the $20 billion.
I'm saying it's enormously in their interest to get a deal because their current budget is insolvent without our contributions. This is a really powerful card. And of course they're saying they want the money up front, because once we've paid the money, they don't have to give us very much.
So this is really important. You're saying, and we've discussed whether or not it's right to call you influential, but you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, are saying that Theresa May should not, maybe even must not, go beyond the 20 billion euros she's promised to the EU as financial settlement.
20 billion is generous. Our negotiating position is so strong because either Germany and the Netherlands and one or two others have to pay more, or Poland, Hungary and one or two others get less. And not only do they get less in the long term, they get less in April 2019. Suddenly, expenditure has to stop.
Somebody, if I may say so, Mr. Rees-Mogg, somebody's going to get found out here. You talk of bluff. Somebody's bluff is going to be called. It's either going to be Europe's, because you say they can't afford not to get at least the 20 billion, or it's going to be Theresa May's government, who are going to find that there will be a crashing out Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, because the Europeans won't give ground on wanting more than 20 billion.
A WTO Brexit is a very good Brexit for the United Kingdom. It frees us from the anti-competitive, protectionist customs union that makes prices for British consumers higher and basically protects inefficient continental European industries. A WTO exit saves us a vast amount of money. It means we get a long way to meeting that commitment that was implied,
this
not officially stated.
WTO Brexit you talk about is a fantasy. I mean, do you know actually how many countries the UK trades with at the moment on WTO rules?
57% of our trade.
24 countries.
But 57% of our trade is non-EU trade, and therefore we either trade with them on a WTO basis or on an individual basis.
There are 24 countries we trade with on a WTO basis. So most of our really important trading partners we trade with as part of the EU bloc. And if we have to renegotiate
you misstate the deals. Most of those deals are joint competence deals, which we have agreed to individually as well, and most of those deals the counterparties have already indicated that they are happy to continue with.
Clearly you're not reading the same things I'm reading, because all sorts of experts on legal, on trade and legal issues say that the idea that we can simply revert to WTO rules and expect our trading relationships to be as good as they have been inside the EU is pure fantasy.
It's really straightforward. I was speaking to, for example, the Singaporean High Commissioner earlier this week. Singapore is immediately ready to novate the deal between the EU and the member states of the EU, because it is a multi-party agreement to the UK once we leave. Those transferals are extremely straightforward. And with the United States, we have no trade deal at all, which is our biggest individual trading partner. It gets forgotten.
I guess it depends who you talk to, I suppose. You sound so very sanguine. It does really depend who you talk to. I don't know if recently you've been talking to Carolyn Fairbairn, the head of the CBI, that is the Confederation of British Industry. She says that her members are deeply alarmed. She says that 60% of companies expect that they must have contingency plans for a crashing out, no-deal Brexit by the end of next March, unless there's a breakthrough before then.
You've got to remember the CBI gets money from the European Union. It is the EU-funded CBI, and they don't like being reminded about that. And their
what about
record,
individual chief executives of companies then? What about Didier Leroy of Toyota, who says a few months ago the UK government was saying we're sure we'll be able to negotiate a deal without any trade tax, but they say that no more. We won't close the plant tomorrow morning, he says, but if we have to decide some future investment, of course, the key point is going to be the competitiveness of this plant in the future.
You raised the CBI, so let's deal with the CBI, because they wanted us to join the exchange rate mechanism and to stay in it. They were wrong. They wanted us to join the euro. They were wrong. The CBI's record of advice to the British government is hopeless. Their predecessor body, just to make the record more historic, it was in favour of appeasement.
The CBI, if I may say so,
is the most consistently wrong body in the country.
In the end, it's the sum of its parts, isn't it? And they're listening to what their members are saying. That is the businesses of Britain, including, I've just given you this quote from Toyota, who were hopeful that there was going to be a deal which would guarantee that they wouldn't suffer tariffs in their manufacture of cars across Europe, including in Britain. And now they no longer have that confidence, and they're saying their investment decisions will have to be made accordingly.
There are no tariffs, even under WTO terms, in components that are imported and then re-exported in the process of manufacturing.
So why are Toyota so worried?
Toyota will know that this is the rule. This is simply
Do you know
how
that Toyota are so worried? I mean, why do you think they are?
Why is it, if people are so worried about investing, that in 2016 the UK received its largest ever FDI and a high share of all EU FDI coming into the United Kingdom? Why was it a record year in 2016? I think you should watch what business are doing and how much they're investing, not what their PR machines are saying.
You don't agree, actually, with some of the key points of Theresa May's proposition put forward at Florence as to how she wants to see the Brexit negotiations go, because she's saying we'd like a 2-year transition, and during that transition we will accept all the rules of the European Union, including recognition of the European Court of Justice, including the principle of freedom of movement, while we negotiate the long-term deal. You regard that as unacceptable, right?
I think that's a mistake. I think it's a political mistake.
Is it a deal breaker for you?
And I think the European Court of Justice should not have any involvement the day after we've left. If the ECJ is still involved, and we still have free movement of people, we have not left the European Union.
So is it a deal breaker for you? Could you imagine, as a Conservative MP, actually voting against that deal?
Let me just finish the sentence, because if those two things apply, it is not a transition, it is remaining in the EU for an extra 2 years. And I think that would not meet the conditions of the vote we had in June last year.
That's an interesting characterisation. So I'm therefore asking you, would that be a deal breaker, and would you as a Tory MP vote against that deal?
Well, the ECJ, from my point of view, is a deal breaker. We must not remain under the jurisdiction of the ECJ.
So if you and those like-minded colleagues vote against that deal, because that's the deal Theresa May wants, she's already outlined it.
If that's what she wants, she will win a vote on that in the House of Commons, regardless of what I do.
Well, you don't know what the Labour Party will do.
They will not vote down a deal that includes the ECJ for an interim period. I can be pretty confident of that. Of course, I can't state it authoritatively.
In a sense, it's interesting to talk about where the Tory party is today. We've just had this very day Nick Bowles, who was a close confidant of David Cameron, a minister in the Cameron government, saying that he thinks the Tory party, to deliver a new message to the British public, has to end all talk of austerity. Austerity is over as far as he's concerned. Now, you are an MP who has consistently supported, for example, all of the cuts to the welfare budget, the benefit system. Do you feel that the Tories need to now develop a message which says austerity is over?
I think Nick Bowles is one of the most important thinkers in the Conservative Party and always worth listening to. His fundamental point was that the deficit as a percentage of GDP was over 10% in 2010 and is now under 3%, and under 3% does not require emergency measures. Having said that, we still need to live within our means, and it's a question of where the money ought to be spent, how the money ought to be spent, and what the priorities are. But I agree with his fundamental point that most of the work of austerity has been done. And I would add on welfare changes. Most of my support for the welfare changes is because I think they will deliver welfare better. I think the universal credit is not there as a money-saving scheme. It is there to help people get back into work, and to look at them as individuals rather than to categorise them as welfare dependents, and to give them the opportunity to lead the lives they want to lead, which is what I think government policy ought to be about. It's not the saving element of it that is important, it's the transformation of welfare that is important.
Your voice matters, and you are avowedly very conservative on a number of social issues. You're an observant Catholic, and
yes.
on abortion, for example, you've been very honest and very clear that you regard abortion as immoral, it's against your beliefs, and you will always campaign to curtail it wherever you can. Against the wishes, it is clear, according to all of the polls, of a big majority of the British people.
There are a variety of polls, as you know, there always are. I think the key point here is, when do you think life begins? And if you think life begins at conception, then you have to protect it, you have a duty to protect it.
And even when a woman wants an abortion after rape, you say that is wrong.
I think that there is a life that has been created, and taking that life does not put right this grave wrong that has already taken place.
Now, we can argue about the detail of polls, but roughly 70% of the British people do not agree with you that abortion is wrong, and they believe that women who want abortions should be allowed to have abortions. So the current law is up to 24 weeks in the pregnancy. Now, my question is simply this. If you are ambitious to play a role, maybe not leader, but an influential role in the Conservative Party, is it possible to hold the sorts of views you do on abortion, on gay marriage too, where, again, you're out of touch with the majority opinion in the country? Is it possible to play a leadership role with your views?
Well, I think this doesn't actually matter. That my job is to represent the people of North East Somerset, and to set out to the people of North East Somerset what I believe, and then they can decide whether to vote for me or not. They may decide that they're more interested in my views on Brexit than they are on abortion, that they think my views on Brexit will have more immediate effect than my views on abortion and other moral issues, though the abortion one is, and indeed the euthanasia one, are the ones that are the most important in my view. But that political life is surely about standing up for what you believe in, not trying to climb the greasy pole. That is a secondary and significantly less important issue.
I don't think anybody would doubt that we want leaders who are honest about their beliefs, but then there's a question of whether certain beliefs make it very difficult to be a credible leader of a nation like Britain. I mean, I'm just thinking of Tim Farron, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, who quit the job saying, because he's a devout Christian too, and he doesn't believe in, for example, gay marriage, he said that he had found himself completely torn between living as a faithful Christian and serving as a political leader. He found it impossible.
Well, I'm not putting myself forward as a political leader, as you know. I think the broader issue, though, is that we live in a tolerant country where people are entitled to their religious beliefs. We have freedom of religion in this country, and inevitably people aren't going to agree with everything I think, or indeed with everything that you think, and that no doubt people don't agree with everything Mrs. May thinks and believes, and yet a leader has to emerge who, over most of the issues, and most of the issues that lead to day-to-day effect, they have confidence in the judgment of the leader. And I think it would be a sad country if religious belief precluded people.
Do you feel in tune, increasingly in tune or out of tune with your own country?
It depends on which subject. That there are some things where I find that I am in very close agreement with what the majority of my fellow countrymen think, and there are other issues where I'm not so closely in touch. If you take The Sun and the Daily Mail as the great barometers of British public opinion, I'm probably pretty in touch.
We have to end it there.
Thank you very much.
Rees-Mogg, thank you for being on HARDTalk.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
We will make America great again.